All right, let's get started. Okay, so hello, my name's Mark. So as well as running the mini-conf, I have prepared a talk. So stories as systems, how emerging narrative tools are shaping the future of storytelling. So we are drawn to stories. There's something essentially human about it. And every new medium, every new technology we come up with, one of the first things that we see is storytelling. It ends up in all new mediums in some way, sometimes immediately, sometimes before the people developing the technology even really understand. It's already turning into storytelling. It is just it's the way that we relate to the world and that we understand it. And so what I'm talking about today is things that already exist from an open source slant, things that could exist, so opportunities. So we have all of this emerging technology. We have new tools, we have these new experiences through these different forms of media. And there are a lot of new ways of telling stories, but at the same time, because storytelling is such a constant in human experience, we have this kind of body of knowledge and body of history that we refer back to. And I think about this in terms of a paradox, where storytelling is both a systematic and highly structured activity, but it also resists being put into a system. It's really hard to define. There's no real complete categorization, even though many people have attempted this. And I'm going to just touch on a little bit of that. Some of you may be familiar with it. But I think what we see when we start thinking about computational media and new forms of storytelling is that there isn't a unified theory of narrative that can fully explain the complexity and effect of storytelling. So often the foundation is thought about as the monomyth. So this originates in a kind of comparative anthropology. Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. It's been thoroughly repudiated and rejected at an academic level, but interestingly enough, it's kind of informed all of Hollywood, and it still has a huge influence. There are a lot of deep problems with it. It's a brilliant idea, but also brilliantly flawed. So like the idea that all stories can be framed as a journey, as a hero's journey, and that there are these parts to that journey which are the same across all stories, across cultures, across mythological traditions, the departure, the ordeal and return. And when you take that as a template and apply it, you do see these patterns start to form, but when you really put it under the microscope, things start to kind of disintegrate. And some of the issues that people today really see with it is that it privileges a male perspective. It kind of venerates the individual. It really puts the focus in a certain kind of form of cultural tradition, and often a patriarchal one. And that is kind of rejected, I think, a lot of the time in new forms of storytelling where people really are trying to branch out and do something different. So we have this real tension there. But I think there are also some real problems with the actual foundation of this idea. So when you start to break down the components of the hero's journey, you find that nobody really sees it in the same way. So Campbell's original work described 17 stages to the hero's journey. We have 8 stages, we have 12 stages. There are books that say 7 basic plots, 20 master plots, 195, and then 2 hero's journeys. So there's really not a coherent understanding of this as a structural kind of, I guess, more of a scientific description. So when it breaks down, it does become a bit vague and hand-wavy. So while it's a powerful guide to stories, it's also really not exact. And that can be kind of hard to work with in a way, because when you do look for something exact, something that you can really rely on and systematize, it starts to sort of evaporate. Another way of looking at storytelling is the really well-known idea of the 3-act dramatic structure. So this comes from Aristotle originally, and again, this has passed through so many different pairs of hands, so many ideas about it over time. Another famous way of looking at it is Freytag's pyramid, which is the similar to the 3-act structure, but it really looks at rising and falling action. And so it frames all stories as this kind of this arc. So rather than a journey, it's like an arc. And then when you look at that, how people understand that, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of books and how-to guides, and this whole field is it's really difficult to make sense of, and everyone who tries to kind of come up with a theory seems to see it in a different way. So it kind of resists systematization, despite the fact that storytelling is based on structure. So we have this interesting paradox at the core. So I'm looking at computational narratives in the context of games and interactive fiction, experimental art projects. These are the kinds of dimensions of media that I'm interested in understanding. Computational narratives are really where we need to rely on the traditions of storytelling to kind of guide us through these new mediums so that we can experience and understand stories while exploring these new dimensions, whether it be visual, whether it be interactive, whether it be kind of collaborative and multiplayer. There's a lot of different there's a lot of different ways of telling stories, more and more and more with every new form of media, and there's also a lot of different ways of trying to actually put storytelling into that media, and it's still kind of a fuzzy and indistinct area. And so I'm thinking about these contexts of whether our goal is to create kind of, I guess, experimental dramatic fiction, whether we have explicit design goals in terms of game systems, dynamically responding to player input, simulation. All this stuff is great and it's really well understood. And if you look out there at the kind of games that are available and the level of detail and fidelity that we see in modern entertainment, it's amazing. But we still need to encode knowledge of narrative structures. We still need that storytelling, that form that people can relate to. And we need that form to be manipulated by our tools and algorithms. So that's kind of why there is a need for stories to be systematic, because these kinds of experiences just simply won't work if we have no knowledge of storytelling. It would just be an open world where you can do anything, but nothing really kind of feels remarkable or distinct. So some of the problems to solve there, as I kind of hinted at, presenting a coherent and a unified story structure. So giving people who are entering these environments a way of actually responding and being kind of present with the story. So being able to kind of grasp the story, understand it, follow it. We also need to have characters that act with motives, that have personality, that actually make sense to us, both dramatically, but also just in terms of their behavior. So again, this is not random. It's something that we intuitively understand really, really well. We're wired to understand social situations, and we get very frustrated very quickly when media doesn't provide us with the sort of believability of character. And then, of course, we have to provide a compelling or entertaining or thought-provoking experience. We really need to have a kind of creative goal, and we need to ensure that there's a real purpose behind the media. I think it's really interesting when you start to look at this area of narrative and storytelling. A lot of these threads and tangents come back to this book, which is it's a wonderful kind of, I guess, artifact of the 1990s sort of new media. Cyberspace is kind of the clue there. That term actually sort of made more sense back then, and it had a context. And this was really the first body of work that kind of outlined this amazing vision for this Hamlet on the holodeck, this idea that you could have these narrative worlds, that people could enter these stories and actually have agency and be able to control and adapt and turn the stories to their own interests and their own goals. So sort of moving away from the idea that the author or the great kind of monomyth tradition defines what the story is, and the audience are kind of passively receiving that story and interacting with it as a given. This is basically the idea that we can have these amazing interactive environments where the people in those environments actually can control the narrative themselves, and they can choose where they want it to go. So let's look at a kind of subset or a sort of extension of computational narrative, which is the idea of, rather than authoring it, actually generating it. So using algorithmic techniques and other generative methods to basically derive these narratives from data. So what leads us here? A huge problem with these expansive story worlds, these big ideas, is that we end up with these colossal state spaces, these environments with characters and rich detail that we just simply cannot afford to write the scale of content that would make sense, or cover all the possibilities. So there's often people frame it as this kind of tension between authoring the content and having authorial control over the story, and really being able to create and shape that experience with having this kind of open-ended simulated world. And the vision of Hamlet on the Holodeck really is that you can combine those two things. But obviously this is very, very hard. And allowing people to interact with it opens up this huge range of questions, because people are going to do things that the author doesn't expect. That's just a given. So one way of thinking about the generative narrative is to think about when things are being created and shaped algorithmically, it's not just about the quantity of what gets generated, it's also about the variation. So we could have a story world with billions, trillions, unimaginably vast possibilities, but if the people in that story world didn't notice any of the difference, it doesn't really matter. So it's really not so much about the state space and the range of possibility, it's actually about what is meaningful and useful, and kind of what can someone get out of that? What are the distinct things that that really make a difference? And so a handful of things that you could use as kind of guidelines to that expressive range. So when you have multiple endings, how do you reach those endings? What are the different pathways or decisions that allow you to get that variation? The way that story beats and dramatic events are distributed. Do some stories have a lot more drama than others, or is there a kind of even sort of things are always happening and then reactions? Are there huge differences in tragic outcomes versus comedic outcomes, those kinds of things. And then the way that we can interact with the characters and the world, and also just the intensity and the difficulty, how people actually navigate through the spaces. So I want to begin deep diving into the technological side by looking at plots and drama as a kind of foundation for narrative. So this is, I think, a very common way that writers and people working in linear media think about things. And as we'll see a little later on, it's really not the only way. And there's actually some kind of surprises and some hidden stuff that hasn't been taken into account. But I think starting with what is really well understood is a good way to kind of orient ourselves in this space. So has anyone familiar with this, seen this before, knows what this is? This is a very kind of infamous or famous meme. This is J.K. Rowling's original plot diagram or table of the Harry Potter series. And it maps out the plot as this giant grid of different events. There's a timeline. It's kind of it's obviously not a spreadsheet. It's on a piece of paper, but it's really is that very, very complex kind of interacting plot elements with this linear narrative. And this is how she thought it through. This is how she made the logic of the world that she was building work. So this has been floating around on the internet for a few years. It's quite an often cited sort of kind of view into how authors write these big complex worlds. Plots, I think one of the first things that you understand about plots when you start to look at it systematically is that they are actually logical structures. In order for a plot to make sense, there needs to be cause and effect. Things need to happen for a reason, and that reason needs to be driven in a temporal way. Unless, of course, your story is about time travel, in which case it gets really interesting and difficult. And this is also why time travel stories are so hard to get right, because we have an intuitive understanding of cause and effect, and we bring that understanding to storytelling. So we need to know that an action in the story is meaningful in terms of how it changes the future of the story, and then we feel like we can follow it like a thread. And that's really logical. And interestingly enough, there is a fairly well understood paradigm for for working with these kind of structures, and that's the domain of planning algorithms. So this stuff goes back to the 1970s, and the idea of a planner is you start from an initial state, so you set up a world, you set up a bunch of logical information about how the world is organized. You have a directory of, or an index of possible actions that you can take, which can change that world, and then you set an end goal. And so these ideas originated in the field of robotics and AI in the 1970s. But you can very quickly see that there's a lot of application to plots and storytelling. The idea that the planner will give you a sequence of actions that leads you all the way to the end goal. And so to map this into a storytelling context, your end goal becomes the conclusion or the end point of your narrative. And so here's an example of some symbolic AI planning that I've been working on. There's a kind of a hello world in this domain is the problem of putting on your shoes. And so obviously to get your shoes on, you need to first put your socks on, at least in this model. And so this is just a very short, quick example of how I actually was experimenting with some of these planning algorithms. And this is one of the first attempts that I had. This is what it looks like. So putting on your shoes, if we ask that for a solution, we get a bunch of different sequences, because all of these different orderings of these events are putting on left sock, putting on right sock, putting on right shoe, putting on left shoe. That's one way of getting to our goal. There are other ways. And so the planning space gives us this kind of access to all the possible paths through the story that are valid. And this is a visualization of the shoes and socks problem. And you can see there the partial order planning algorithm, which I was working with, actually doesn't define how those actions happen. It just simply says there is a causal link between these things and here's how you get to the goal. But then when you actually play that out, and this is really important for generating stories, is that you actually do end up with a total order. So the story does have to end up in a sequence somehow. Now obviously I didn't spend all this time working on these planning algorithms to solve the problem of putting on shoes and socks. I actually wanted to use it for something. And this is a snapshot of a current project that I'm working on. So this is a generated novel. It's called Dreams of Golden Weather. It's about a secret AI project in the 1970s in New Zealand, and this concrete brutalist underground computer that takes up multiple floors of this building. And it's about a technician who has to fix this computer, and the computer is malfunctioning. And the planning algorithm basically provides a whole bunch of possibilities for how that technician interacts with the computer, the story of the different events, how it breaks down, and then I have generators in behind that actually create the text. So in this case, what you see is some kind of logical and structured information that drives the story forward, which comes from the sequence that comes out of the planner, and then the rest of it is bizarre, sort of dreamlike generated text. So this is a starting point that I've been exploring with these planning algorithms, and I'm hoping to turn this into a print book as well as a PDF shared online. There are many variations of this, so it's kind of interesting to figure out how do you actually distribute a piece of work like that when there isn't really one definitive version of the work. And I think what I've started to learn from doing this exploration, and this is very specific to this particular area of planning algorithms, is that a lot of what's already out there and what's understood in this domain is it doesn't come from art or a creative practice. It comes from a computer science focus, and so there's a lot of emphasis on optimization, finding the most efficient path to the goal, or ways of handling the combinatorial explosion of planning states in the middle of running. So, and you can imagine in the 1970s, these algorithms were understood on paper, but it was very hard to actually run this stuff. Today, we have a lot more memory, we have a lot more processing power. That's a complete understatement. So it's actually quite practical to use this kind of stuff now, and you don't really run into too much trouble with actually getting it to to return a result, but there's often weird issues with when you add more and more and more complexity, it starts to explode. And so there is like huge amounts of research and understanding of that, but it's not really focused on the kind of problems that you run into creatively. And the other thing is that the planning algorithms aren't really set up to do what you need in storytelling. So it kind of works in a very baseline way, but once you start to get creative with it, you run into these issues. So with storytelling, you actually need other affordances than optimization. You need to think about conflict or spectacle or dramatic arcs. So often you don't want the shortest path to the goal. You want a path that meanders around some interesting events. You want to have a story that is meaningful, and there's kind of a strength to the storytelling that you don't get when you just zoom through the state space and find that solution. Those stories tend to be very boring, and so there's a really interesting tangent of research looking into how can we extend these planning algorithms to actually incorporate these narrative ideas. So here's a couple of the fairly well-known ones, at least well-known in this kind of niche community that I'm sort of working in. So the first one is the idea of extending the partial order planning to have intentions, so that you can add logical information about the intention of different characters, the intention of different story elements. Often in these systems you see fate used as a kind of character itself, and that's quite a heavy-handed but useful way to drive the story, push it in the directions that you want it to go in. And then the next one is the idea of introducing conflict. So that's really an extension of intention. That's saying, what if we can navigate the plan space using conflict between characters, or conflict in situations where we can balance the competing needs, so that we're not just trying to find a path through the story, we're actually trying to balance the competition between different actors in the story. And so here's an example of this algorithm put to use. I haven't got this far in my own personal work. This is from an academic paper. And it's probably quite hard to make sense of, but basically this is a story set in a Western world. There's a character called Timmy who gets bitten by a snake. Being bitten by the snake prompts Hank, his father, to travel to the general store and steal medicine from Carl. Hank wants to return to the ranch and heal Timmy, but the plan gets thwarted because the sheriff comes along. And then in answer, William travels to the general store and starts a shootout that kills Hank. And so there's this kind of chaotic but actually quite dramatic interactions between these characters, and it's all worked out in using these kind of logical structures. And then at the end of here, finally, you see Carl ends up with the medicine, and Timmy is dying, so it's kind of sad. So there's a sort of tragic aspect to that. But the story, there's a lot more possibilities in the story space. So you can run it multiple times. You can see these conflicts between these characters can be worked out in different ways, and there's interesting possibilities for parameterizing that. There is another way of looking at this area of plot generation, which is using a very niche form of logic programming called linear logic. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because it's sort of well beyond the scope of this talk, but a really straightforward high-level way of understanding it is instead of thinking about AI and planning, we can think about stories as logical or mathematical proofs. So there's almost like a dual or a mapping between a narrative structure and a proof structure, and we can actually use logic programming that can sort of theorem-proving style logic to trace causal paths through different resources that can be built up, different actions that can be taken in the story world and reach a goal state, and that corresponds to a proof search. So here's an example of that. It's rewriting Madame Bovary, which is a famous French novel by Flaubert, and it's a fairly well understood, well studied piece of literature. What the authors of this paper have done is model every event in that novel in a logical form using linear logic, and then basically run proof searches on it and see how many different stories they can extract out of it. And it turns out they were able to generate hundreds and hundreds of different stories, all from the core elements of the novel. And here's a couple of examples. So, and you can see there's a varying level of complexity in events. So there's one where there's a big set-piece scene where Emma attends a ball. And in the first example, she doesn't attend the ball, but she still has the same motivation to escape her kind of stultified and boring life. And she ends up defenestrating, throwing herself out a window. And then in the other variation, again, there's a lot of events that parallel the story, but there's a few differences. She becomes sick, she starts another love affair, and then she gets ruined, which is a parallel to the original story, and then ingests arsenic. So you have these story structures that are they resonate with the original work, but they end up in incredibly different plots and narratives. So I want to sort of dig a little deeper than that, and kind of go beyond the basic ideas of linear plots, and talk about the actual atomic components of stories, scenes and passages. So we talked earlier about monomyth and about these ideas of modeling narrative. They're actually not as popular as you might think, given all of the books about stories and how to write a novel and screenwriting. A much more practical and kind of more recent and modern way of thinking about stories is this idea of scenes and sequels. Another thing you hear a lot is the idea of story beats. So these small dramatic moments that kind of drive the action forward. So it's really thinking about the story in terms of actually what happens in the story, rather than trying to apply this really high level kind of global logic on the story. And so scene and sequel is really all about tension and release. And there's obviously parallels to music or a lot of ideas in software, and this is quite interesting how many parallels there actually are. And so this is actually a really fruitful way of looking at storytelling, because it is incredibly amenable to computational methods. And I'm going to go into a bit of detail about that. I think most people are familiar with branching narratives. This is often the first thing you think about when you hear the ideas sort of computational narrative or whatever thrown around. The most important thing about branching narratives is that this is just one model of computational storytelling. It's not the be-all and end-all. So often people make the mistake of thinking that anything that's kind of non-linear, any story that's kind of driven by computational media is one of these kind of these branching narratives. It's not really like that. This is actually a specific form of storytelling. It involves choices and alternate endings. So while it's the first thing that people think of, it's really well understood, it really is just one way. I think what's important about this is that it's linear, so it does follow that traditional idea of plots and sequences. One of the most popular tools, it's open source, editor called Twine, and this actually gives you a visual representation of your story and allows you to link multiple passages together. It kind of follows the idea of the web, so it's hypertext based, but it gives you this control over how you link the different components together. And so you can build these enormous or very small kind of looping story structures. You have a lot of freedom with this, but it's also kind of limited in the sense that the story is kind of fixed. You put these nodes, you link them together, you put the story into place, and that's really all you get. And so thinking about that in comparison to the dynamic plot generation, this is a more of an authored model. This really requires a lot of input, a lot of thinking about what you want the story to be. And it doesn't really solve the problem of the combinatorial explosion, because you have to end up making all of those pathways through the story work. So you've got to write them at some point. There are probably ways of extending it to do generative stuff, but I think it would be quite complicated. And so extending on that, a really common way of working with the kind of scenes or passages approach, is structuring your story as a series of these scenes and passages. It's just scripting, and this is it's really well understood by most people that know how to use programming languages, which I think is why it's so popular and widespread. Markdown and markup languages like that are also another big influence on these methods. So I'll just kind of cycle through some of the open source tools that are available for this kind of writing. So ink is used for creating narrative games. It's basically a text syntax for generating choices and nesting different fragments of text that you can navigate through in a game context. And it has an architecture of basically there's an editor, you generate a script from it. The logic is fairly straightforward, and it's sort of based on nesting and hierarchy, branching. And then there's a middleware so you compile the script, there's a middleware component that you can put into an environment that actually reads that and can be played or read from different game environments. So it doesn't make any decisions about how you actually tell the story, how you make the choices. It just gives you that map of the story and all the writing inside it. A similar approach, which is more traditional, is choice script. And this is a little bit more imperative. You can see it's got the if-else statements, which are sort of inherently part of the language. And it's similar to ink in the sense that it's influenced by Markdown with the bullet lists. So it's and a lot of game studios and people working with this technology have rolled their own. This is a really kind of big thing to do. If you're interested in visual novels or kind of interactive sort of storytelling with more of a comic basis, there is another scripting language called RenPy, which is it's based on Python and it's actually embedded in Python. And this is it's less imperative in terms of the if-else statements. It's more like there's like go-to statements where you can kind of jump around. So if anyone who's as old as me remembers playing around with BASIC in the 80s and writing little pick-a-path adventures, this is really just a very sophisticated and cool way of extending that kind of approach. There's a lot of limitations to this, the style of scripting, and it goes back to the combinatorial explosions. It's just a lot of hard work and a lot of effort to manually branch everything. And so an interesting alternative is the idea of storylets, which is instead of writing these linear structures, have a pool of standalone story fragments or passages that can be unlocked in any order. And so gate access to the narrative through scripting and decisions that are separate from the narrative structure. And an extension to that that sort of flows from that is this idea of quality-based narrative. So that's where you have your entire story world organized in these pools of possible little sub-stories that you can interact with. You can navigate through it in any order you want, and you can have stats, you can have kind of properties that attach to you as a reader or player as you go through it, and then those properties can unlock different elements of the story, and so you get a lot of choice around how. So even though the story is completely authored, you have complete control over how you actually build that story. You can choose which possibilities you want. And there's a couple of examples here. One is from a game which is quite well known. It's actually where the term quality-based narrative comes from, which is Sunless Sea by Fail Better. And there's another example from a more experimental game which has been kickstarted at the moment, which is about taking that quality-based approach and applying it to gender, where that gender actually becomes a mechanic in the game, and that unlocks the story possibilities. So there's a lot of potential there, but it's still locked into the kind of linear model, and you still have to author all the content. So it's a lot of work. So let's look at another way of framing narratives and understanding the kind of computational media aspects of when the possibilities here. So that's characters and conversation. So there's a traditional approach to writing parser-driven games, or like the interactive fiction that you might remember from the 80s, Zork, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that kind of thing. And there's been like years of work in some of the more recent games that are actually really interesting, doing different things. But I guess the whole idea of interacting with the world and operating kind of on the world using verbs, so you type a verb in and you do something, that approach is really good at rooms, moving through rooms, going north, south, east, west, or opening doors, going into containers. But that's not really the basis of stories, you know. It's very hard to make a compelling story out of opening boxes. I mean, people have done it, but there are other things that we want from stories than just opening boxes and moving north and south and going through doors. And a huge part of that is conversation and interacting with characters. So the standard way that this is done is through dialogue trees, which is where you just model the entire conversation, kind of like the branching narratives that we looked at earlier, but on a statement by statement basis. So how do you interact with a character? Well, here's all the possible things you can say, and then here's all their possible reactions. And again, you can see how this is really straightforward to understand and work with, but it also doesn't solve that computational explosion. But I do want to dig into some of the more interesting open source tools that are coming out around this. So Yarn and Yarn Spinner are, and there's links to the websites there if you want to take a look. Yarn is kind of, it's I guess inspired by Twine and takes it a little further, in that you're no longer modeling passages or story fragments. You're now modeling conversations. You're modeling a line of dialogue in each node and the possibilities of that dialogue, and you can make really interesting narrative games through that, because the game, again, it uses that middleware architecture of you've got an editor. That editor generates a script, and then your middleware inside whatever environment, whatever UI, basically reads from that and can present the navigation and the possibilities to the player. What I find interesting about this, though, isn't so much the authoring and the understanding of the branching dialogue, but it's kind of what you can do with it once you have your narrative modeled as a graph structure. And this is where we actually do start to see some answers to these combinatorial explosions. So this is a tweet from John, who's been working on the Yarn Spinner tool, and he's showed this amazing new tool that he's been working on to take these dialogue systems and basically check them. So you can jump to any state in the narrative and then move on from there. So it saves a lot of time. You can also actually analyze your dialogue and find unreachable branches, find bugs, find flaws in it, because the structure, if you use it effectively, actually allows you to do that. And I think this is really starting to get interesting in terms of it's actually helping authors to collaborate with the computer and taking our possibilities further. So we're not just having to manage all these states in our head, but actually use the capabilities of the form that we put our text into to give us these kind of superpowers. If anyone's ever had to debug like a chat bot or a dialogue tree, you'll really understand what the benefits here are. So back to the holodeck, conversations, interacting with the world state. Conversation's really the thing that brings narratives together with the world state. There's different ways of thinking about how we can work with these story worlds. So there's the idea that we can have agency that influences the story, that changes the way we can select and follow the narrative, versus effect, which is really like how do we influence the world state? And that's the opening boxes, containers stuff. And another way to think of this is the interface between the world and the plot. So you can imagine in a story environment, things that affect the world state are really decisions about which way to go, and they're different verbs. So searching the cellar, unlocking the cabinet, going up to the attic. The actions that modify things in the world. Whereas with agency, we're talking about like a single action, but different outcomes for that action. So in this case, we might say something, but how do we say it? And then how does that affect the world in terms of influencing the social state, which is less about tweaking a word model and more about driving the narrative. So this is really where we start to get that word plot interface thing happening. And so we can think about conversations as narrative in their own right. We have conflict and resolution, we have changing social relationships, goals, persuasion, knowledge that goes in and out depending on what is said and what is left unsaid. So there's extraordinary possibilities to actually turn these kinds of things into story and game mechanics in their own right, but it's very, very hard. This is a huge open opportunity to really, I think there's not really any open source tools that have kind of nailed this particular area. So I think like I'm super interested in seeing where this can go, and I guess with machine learning and natural language processing as well. And probably the thing that's further along is a tool called Spirit AI, which does a lot of these things, but there's not really anything open source out there yet. So, you know, opportunity, possibilities. And I just want to kind of sum that up by looking at Pride and Prejudice is a great example where you can understand it as a plot, you can understand it as a series of events, but it makes so much more sense to look at it as like a construct, a social construct, a network of relationships. And this is really the foundation of the story. The plot kind of grows out from this. This is the starting point. So the idea of modeling narratives in a plot-driven planning way is kind of, it reaches this limitation, and things like Pride and Prejudice are far better worked through from the opposite direction, starting with the social structure and the relationships and conversation models, and then realizing a plot or a sort of an extension of those interactions into a compelling story. So that's another way of thinking about it. But like I say, it's really hard, and this is probably really the forefront of this area of research. But I think in the next few years, we're going to see some really interesting ways of kind of harnessing computational media to actually make these stories come alive. And so finally, I want to talk about another area of narrative structure, which really is far less understood, but it's actually potentially the most interesting from a creative perspective. So another way you can think about narrative is, rather than looking at it as kind of structures or a way of kind of associating a sort of perspective with the plot, is the totality of experience that someone has when they are engaged with the story. It's a subjective journey. But we can also flip that and say it's not really just about the, obviously you want to write for readers or design for players, but what about the authoring experience? What about the ideas behind the story? And how can we sort of think about the fuzzy boundaries of creativity that kind of goes into like the idea of a story? So here's a cover of Gravity's Rainbow, which is a super difficult and weird mid-20th century American novel. Some of you may be familiar with it. The narrative structure of the story is kind of, it's about World War II and military-industrial complex and V2 rockets. And this cover actually kind of reinforces that plot, in that the plot has a kind of, it's famous sort of for having this allusion to this arc, this trajectory of this rocket. And how do we get ideas like this into our computational media? This is kind of how novels are constructed, it turns out, in ways that are really different to what we assume and what we think, especially from what we've just looked at, all these different ways of systematizing stories, constructing narratives. Here's another example. This is a Booker Prize-winning novel by a New Zealand author, Eleanor Catton. The structure of this novel is really intricate. Basically, each chapter and each sequence is constructed from horoscopes, and the movement of the planets in the horoscopes corresponds to the characters and how they are situated in the story. And it evolves through this sequence of, as there are conjunctions between these planets and things move through the houses of the astrological star charts, we see these different characters come in and come out, and the narrative unfolds with this kind of clockwork resonance to this model that's sitting behind the story. I mean, this is really, really difficult and really weird stuff, but it's executed to such a phenomenal level of detail. And then the visualization there actually shows how that structure relates to the text itself. And so you see these 12 parts slowly collapse down, each section getting smaller and smaller until we reach the very end where it's just a single passage. So we have this incredibly intricate and crafted structure. This is the height of creativity, really, to put a structure like that and then have a coherent story with dramatically interesting kind of flow and character interactions move through it. And this is just, it's not really thought about by people kind of outside writing novels. One of the most interesting reference points that I've found here is this Australian book. It came out a few years ago, and it basically talks about how a bunch of modern Australian novels were written. And it turns out the process is really fraught, really mixed up, and really kind of, I guess it's affirming in some ways, because the level of doubt and frustration they have is kind of comforting when you're feeling doubt and frustration about what you're doing. And to see the results, you would not think the messiness and chaos that led to them. But writers have a lot of really weird and interesting approaches, and a lot of it's kind of intuitive, but there is kind of what I think about as structural creativity. So there's kind of open-ended pen and paper sketching narrative structures that are they're aesthetic and vague. They're not sort of direct and systematic. But this is a huge part of writing novels, it turns out. And none of our narrative tools, none of our computational methods really incorporate these approaches. So I think there's a huge opportunity there to try to combine some of this thinking. And it's really almost a different form of cognition, a different way of understanding storytelling. But it's very much from the perspective of the creator. So how do we tap into that? So I was looking for things that kind of do tap into that, and this is one of the more interesting ones that I know of, which is basically like what she called a recombinatorial fiction, where there are these interesting UI elements. There are different properties and forms that you can select, and by rearranging these things, both visually and in terms of text selection, you can explore this narrative. So it's free association. It's really wild creativity. It's not driven by any of the narrative structures we looked at, but it leads to some really interesting outcomes in terms of juxtapositions and flow. And I think taking things like this, taking combinations of elements and rearranging them, shuffling them like cards, is potentially one way that we can tap into that creativity, or visual structures, like dragging and dropping those little dots into sockets, and being able to rearrange almost like reading tea leaves or scattering yarrow stalks or rolling dice, not just focusing on the numbers that we get from that, but also the shape that they create. And here's another example of a New Zealand novelist, Pip Adam, and this is her kind of revealing her working process. And this is super interesting as well, because this is how she is visualizing her early work in terms of creating a novel. And it's totally distinct to her. It doesn't really mean anything to anyone else, but it shows how she's not really thinking in terms of that J.K. Rowling plot structure. She's thinking in terms of shapes and feelings and a journey that's much more abstract, and a kind of way of understanding what happens through these kind of interesting diagrams. The sort of idiolect graphical language that she's created specifically for the book. And so, yeah, I'm thinking about how can we incorporate this kind of thinking into our tools. Obviously, huge limitation here is that we use words like vibe and flavor, or these vague and hard to think about things, and to integrate them in computational media, we need these kind of systems. We need data. We need it to be amenable to some form of logic. And so this is really where it gets difficult. But there are huge possibilities here as well, because there are no limits to how data can be transformed and mapped. So we can take almost any data, and we can map it or rearrange it into a form that we can read from our computational tools. So I don't see the limitations as holding this back. I more see it as a kind of a call for how can we be more creative and think about it in a totally different way. So we're not necessarily writing linear text. There are lots of different ways that we can use data. And I think the forefront of computational media and narrative tools is really looking at how do we start to go beyond these graph structures, beyond these logical structures, and into the realm of creativity. And that's all I have today. Thank you very much. Cool. I think we have a couple of minutes for some questions if anyone has a question they want to ask.
My question would just be about these kind of AI story generator things. What's your opinion on them?
Well, I think you see a lot of stuff coming from different communities. So there's an AI research community, and they bring a certain attitude to storytelling. Then there's the people working in computational narrative and narrative designers. They look at it in a completely different way. So how I would sum that up, it actually, I'll reference something that Jay pointed out in their talk earlier, which is seeing the computer as a collaborator, as an entity that's part of the creative process that you're collaborating with, not just using it as a tool to drive the process. That's the kind of opinion and angle you get from the narrative people, whereas the machine learning people, they don't really think about it like that. They more see it as how can we do everything inside this kind of machine learning process, or how do we generate everything from like a single bootstrapped process or whatever. So there's kind of that. And I think the other thing is there's a question of purpose. Like what is the purpose of generating a narrative? And often it comes down to like the goals of telling the story are like really different to say the goals of a self-driving car. And the results are also very different. The kind of things you need to do with machine learning in order to make good stories are quite there's kind of an art to it, actually. It's a bit messy, so it hasn't really exploded. And so a lot of people are out there saying, oh, machine learning is going to replace script writing. I don't know that that's true or not, because do we want every script that we generate in future to be referenced by previous scripts, or do we still want that possibility of something new? And also I think, script writers are basically already doing that. So we're already in this kind of local maxima of basically cloning the past, and that's just people handwriting it. So that might be a bit cynical, but I think I personally see the point of view of the collaboration with the machine being the best reference point for how to think about it. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? No, all right, okay, well, let's go.